We're going to have a, I think, pretty exciting day. We're going to talk today. We're going to review the homework. We are going to talk a little bit more about controllers. And then we are going to do somewhat of a deep dive into the model layer of Rails. So we'll be creating a model. We're going to put some data into a database, I think. We're going to query that database. And we're going to try to integrate the controller layer of MVC with the model layer of MVC. Okay, so anonymous attendee says, can you quickly explain the difference between the three layers again? Yeah, I can. So there are three layers in a Rails application. The Rails application uses an MVC architecture. And let me just go ahead and share. Share so that I can maybe draw a little diagram, because I think it might be helpful. And in the meantime, feel free to continue to drop questions and things like that. So MVC stands for model and view and controller. And when I think about these things, I actually like to think about them this way. So model, controller, view. So MCV, even though it is popularly MVC. So what each of these things do, so they each have a function. The model you can think of as the layer that talks to the database. So it's how your actual data is structured in your application. The controller, like we said yesterday, is deciding what to do when you go to a certain part of a web page. And then the view part here is saying, what does it look like? Okay. So in a practical sense, the view is talking about HTML. The controller is talking about when you go to a certain URL, how do I respond to it? And the model is interactions with the actual database. So we'll go through each of these. The order that we're going to go through them is we kind of covered a little bit of controller yesterday. We'll talk more about controllers. We're going to talk about models today. Then we're going to spend some time digging into HTML before looping back to views. So we'll talk about, in order, controller, models, and views. Felipe says, this three layers are very similar in all languages. Well, it's not really about languages as much as it's about web frameworks. So there are different web frameworks, and a lot of modern web frameworks like Rails do something similar to this model view controller or model controller view architecture. Karthi KWD says, where do routes stay in the MVC architecture? They are kind of outside of this, but you can think of them as tied to the controller. So the routes file, like we saw yesterday, is a mapping between what URL there is and which controller and action pair those are actually mounted up to. So I hope that helps explain the difference. Felipe says model, backend, controller, front end, view, HTML. Yeah, roughly. It's a little weird because like all of this is technically backend, right? When you think about backend, front end, you're typically talking about JavaScript as the front end, and the back end is all of these things. So this is a backend or a server-side application, and these are just kind of the three components that go together. Yeah, and other languages have frameworks that have similar ideas. This idea is not specific to Rails. It just happens to be the one that Rails uses. Okay, cool. I think that there are probably enough people here to get started. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start just like we always do by diving into exercise 6. So in exercise 6, we're going to set up Rails in our code space. I think I'm not going to go through this part because it's going to take a little bit too long, but if you're interested in setting it up, we did it yesterday in class. So you can reference yesterday's video. So we have this giant Rails app sitting off to the side, and we're able to start a Rails server. Start the server using Rails server or Rails S and view the page in your browser. So we can verify that if I go here, I can refresh this, and this is going to actually go and hit my Rails application, and it will refresh. And I can see that it refreshed in the server logs down here. I can see the request came in. It says there was a request for the slash or root URL, and that it returned a 200, which means that the page returned successfully. So this is all, there's a lot of detail in here that will make more sense as we go deeper into things, but this is just telling us that the request came in. It's a log of all the requests that happened. The next part of the exercise is to create a root route and controller that outputs in plain text a random name from an array of friends. So this is probably the easiest homework so far if you've got Rails set up. I mean, really the point of this homework was to get you set up in Rails and code spaces. So we're going to do this real quick. I think it's going to be pretty easy. So we'll create a friends array. So my friends are Kate, Abby, you're my friend, and Jimmy. And then what we'll do is we'll write, instead of, okay, the time is time.now, I'm going to change it to, okay, my friend is named. And then we'll use a variable called name of friend. Now, name of friend is not defined, so we'll have to define it. And when we define it, we're just going to define it to friends.sample. So I dropped a little tip here that we could use array sample method. If you created a controller called array controller, it's fine. Don't worry about it. But the idea of this tip was that using the array sample method would make your life a little bit easier here to pick a random name. The reason for that is if we look up the documentation for array, you'll see in the list on the left-hand side that there's a sample method. The sample method chooses a random element out of the array. Okay. So when I write name of friend equal friends.sample, it's going to give me one of the random names. So then we can go over to our web server and I can just refresh and you'll see it picking a random name kind of every time that I refresh the page. And that's the entirety of exercise 6. I saw some people use functions like rand to do something like this. That's fine. It's fine. It's not, sample is just a way to not have to write the word rand. And actually, if we look at, we can actually look at how sample works. It's complicated, but at the end of the day, it's really just about picking a random number and then choosing that element of the array. Rubina says, does Rails also serve as a framework for other front-end applications? It does not. It will allow serving. Things like JavaScript, which we're going to see later in the course. So it does interact with other things, but it is not. It is only for Ruby, if that makes sense. Manon says render plain names.sample made a Rails app at time.now. Yeah, so combining what the code used to be and what it is now, definitely a fun idea. Andrew says, I thought that create a root route means we had to create a new record in routes.rb, but it appears that we cannot have 2 root records. That's correct. Yeah. So the idea here, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this because I have it on my list of things that I wanted to talk about. If I'm going to go into config, I'm going to go back to that routes file that we were talking about yesterday. And I want to point out something that I think I pointed out after a lot of people left yesterday, which is yesterday we were writing this, and it can be kind of confusing. Another way you can write the same thing, just to show you what's really going on here, is you can write it like this. Okay. So what this really means is just this, it's a shorthand for writing this, which is that when you go to the root URL, I want you to load the controller called home controller and call the method or action called index, which we see here, home controller, method or action called index. I hope that makes sense. And the reason you can only have one of these is because only one thing can be the root, meaning like it wouldn't make sense for, if you had two things that were at the root, then when someone went to that root URL, how would it pick which one was the one that was supposed to execute? So that's why there can only be one root. There can only be one route that is mapped to any given action controller pair. It doesn't create an index.html file. When you go to this root URL, we'll run the code inside of the home controller. And then when you call render plain, whatever the string that is to the right side of plain is just going to output that into the browser. And remember, what we've kind of done here is we've given the ability for all of the Ruby and Rails code that we've written so far to essentially make a jump from before, where we could only run code down here in this console. Now we're able to take our code and make it do something that appears inside of a web browser. So what Rails has done for us is it's essentially let us run a web server to get our Ruby code into a web browser. Erica, Erica asks, so there's no need for HTML. There is a need for HTML, and we're going to get to that when we get to the view layer of Rails. So the view layer of Rails is implemented partially in HTML, which we're going to talk about later in the course. Just haven't gotten there yet. Anonymous attendee says, I made a new controller for friend, so I'll have to go to /friends. Yep, that's fine. So, you know, if someone made a new controller, they might have done something like this: get friends, controller, friends, action, index. So this would be, again, this would be a friends controller and an action called index. This is also just totally fine. The only difference is that when you go here, you'd have to go to /friends at the end. Anonymous attendee says, why are there parentheses for the render line on a controller file? So what they're asking is, why are these parentheses here? Well, first off, I'll tell you that the parentheses are optional. The reason I added the parentheses here is because I really just want to drive home for everybody that there's nothing special about render. Render is just the method call, just like all the other method calls that we've made over the past 5 days. Render is just another method call. And the parentheses kind of hopefully drive that home for everyone, that render is not special. There's nothing special about it. It's just a call to a method called render. So they're optional, just like all, remember, all methods. If I want to say puts hello, that's actually a call to a method called puts. You could just the same, you could write it like this, like we talked about earlier. Same thing here. Render doesn't need these, they're optional. But I really just wanted everyone to be aware of the fact that render is just a method. Julie J says, would you ever have a condition that shows which root would appear based on who the user is? You can. I would look in, if you're interested in that, I would go look into it. You can do that. It's definitely possible. It's not very common because for the most part, when you go to the root page of a website, all users pretty much see, if they might not see the same contents, but they do see the same action, if that makes sense. They see the same thing. So they might see like information different depending on who they are, but they all see roughly the same type of thing when they go to the page. Luis says, so inside the class controllers, we can write variables without the @ beforehand. No, it's not any different from a normal class. So These don't have the app beforehand because we're never needing to access friends outside of the index method. If we needed to, then we would have to put the app beforehand. So remember, without the app is a local variable, meaning it's only accessible inside of this method called index. With the at is an instance variable, and that'll be accessible to other methods, potentially, if you called them. So, and I mean, this is just a class, just like the other classes that we learned about previously. So you could even do something like make a private method called choose a friend and take all of this behavior, move it down into there. And then because of implicit return, you don't need name of friend anymore, right? And then this line up here could just change into choose a friend. So this is how we're going to use these like fundamental concepts that we learned about classes, instance variables, etc., to build applications. So because this is just a class, we can have private methods just like any other class that we talked about in the past. So as things get more complicated, we have those tools that we learned from object-oriented programming that we can go use. Anonymous Sandy says, waiting to see how we add more pages, routes to the app. Yeah, so the way you do it is like I showed before. I'll just show it again briefly. So you have the root, which is the base one, and then you would have get, and then the name of the other page that you wanted to get, which would have a controller, which points to a controller, and an action, which points to the action. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm going to the home controller and an action called other page, which would then require me to essentially implement other page here. And if I do that and I save it, now I can go here and I can see my base page. And if I go to slash other page, I can see the implementation of the other page, which flows through the other method. So I want you to think the routes file is basically like your directory of how all the pages work. And the controller is the implementation of what they actually do when someone uses them. Rubina says, can you please repeat the friend controller thing you just talked about? I think I just did. So if I didn't cover what you wanted, then let me know. But the idea is that the controller part of each of these lines basically is the name of a controller. So if you wanted to have multiple controllers, you can have that. You would just change the controller name here to be something like friends. Erica says, can you go through the file structure of a Rails app? I think I like the idea, but I think I'm going to avoid doing that because there's just so much here. And I don't want people to be overwhelmed. Can we write multiple things in the index method? Like, could we print out a friend name as well as like the current time? You cannot call render multiple times. You can only call render one time. So while you can print out multiple things, you can only make maximum one call to render. So if you wanted to print multiple things, you just have to build a string that contains more things inside of it. And then once we get into the view layer, you'll see that there are other ways to accomplish that. Hassan says, could you have an initializer in the home controller? I think technically you could, although that is not something you're ever going to see anyone do. Typically, the only public methods that should be defined on a controller are the ones that are actions, that are actually actions, like in this case, index and other page. Pretty much everything else should be private, and initializers don't make a ton of sense inside the controller. There are other, like if you want something that runs before all of the controllers actions, there are other ways to do that, which we'll see later. Rubina says, so the name after get and action need to be the same. No, they don't. This can be anything. So this is the actual path, the part after the domain name that you're going to get the page. This is the controller that's used, and this is the method on the controller that gets used. Sarah says you have to enter new controllers in the terminal. Yeah, you have to do Rails G controller and the name of the controller. Alternatively, if you don't want all those files, you can just create a new file over here. You can just go here and you can say, I want a new file called friends controller. And then you'll get the same thing. But the easiest way is in the terminal for sure. Piara says, can I put XML tags in the render method? You can, but because we're using plain, they're not going to render HTML. So I would just wait until we get to the view layer, and then we'll learn how to do that the right way. Lucienne says, how do routes work with links to subpages? We'll talk about that also when we get to the view layer. Okay, cool. Does the homework make sense to people? How I ended up doing this, and I ended up making, choosing a random friend. Okay, then we are going to learn a whole bunch of new stuff, and we're going to learn about models and how they connect to the database. Okay, so before I teach that, I'm going to teach you one more thing about controllers, which is called params. So I want to make a new route, and I want to make it so that it goes like this. I want to call the route Sayhello, and then inside of this string, remember this is just the string, it's just a normal string. I'm going to do /sayhello and then name. Okay, and I'm going to have that route to, again, the home controller, just to avoid having to create a new controller. And the action, I'm going to call Sayhello. Now, you probably noticed that in my URL, I called it say-hello. In the action, I called say_hello. The only reason for that is that method names in Ruby can't have dashes in them, because the dashes would look like minus signs. So this is a case, I think someone asked before, Rubina asked, does the name after get and the action need to be the same? This is a case where I'm purposely making them not the same. So one of them has a dash, the other has an underscore. Okay. Now I'm going to go over to the controller, and I'm going to implement a Sayhello method. And I'm just going to write hello. So let's start by making sure that this works. Now you probably noticed what I did here is I did Sayhello, and then I did :name. So let's go to that URL and let's see what happens. Sayhello, :name. Okay, and we get the output that we expected. We get hello. Okay. So now what I want to do to add to this is I want to say hello, and then I want to say hello to a certain person. So I want to say hello and name. So that means we have to define a local variable called name. And I'm going to define it to this thing, params, and then a square brace, and then the symbol name. Okay. So what's going to happen is when you do params of name, what that means is in the path here, if there's something with a colon before it, that whatever you put in there is going to show up in this params, which is just a hash. So params, you can imagine, is like a hash. And when you specify name, that's going to be inside of there. So if I go to /sayhello/John, it's going to be name John. If I went to sayhello/Kate, then it's going to show up as a hash, which contains a key, which is the symbol name, and the value, the string Kate. I hope this is making sense. So my routes file basically has this piece where I say, I want the route that the user goes to be /sayhello and then a slash, and then anything. And then we capture essentially that anything in a place where we can refer to it by params with the key that is the name that we used. Okay, so just to make it really clear, I know I've heard some feedback about people not liking name being the thing. Imagine if this said first name, say hello / first name. Then all of a sudden these would come in as hashes where the key was first name. Okay, so if this makes more sense, we have name coming in as params of first name. Okay, so I'm going to save that. I'm going to go to the web browser. I'm going to refresh it. You're going to see that it says hello : name. The reason it says that is because up here we have : name here. So if I change that to John, now all of a sudden we're able to get information from the URL onto the page. So we've taken some information that's part of the URL and can be anything that we don't even have to tell it what it can be beforehand. And we're able to get that information into our controller. Once it's in our controller, we're able to use it in a render statement. So we're able to take a piece of information from the URL and get it. Yeah, so params I want you to think of as all of the custom parts of the URL are inside of this params hash. Actually, I can even prove that. So check this out. I'm going to do inside of my controller, I'm going to write puts params.inspect. Okay. And then I'm going to refresh the page again. Remember, I have say hello / Julian. Now I'm going to go back to the other page, and somewhere in here, there's going to be the output. And look, it's just a hash. And one of the things in the hash is the key first name with the value Julian. Okay, I'm going to stop here for a second because there's going to be some questions. So I'm going to answer those questions. Erica says, so can you write APIs in the controller? You can write anything you want in the controller. So you can respond to different things. I hope that answers your question. Although if you're talking about something specific like JavaScript, I will address that in a second. The next question I'm seeing is Piara Nando says, but a hash can also execute arbitrary JavaScript code. No, it cannot. Your statement that there is no sanitization is incorrect because we're rendering via plain text. So the actual document that's being rendered here is not an HTML document. Okay. It's just text. Furthermore, even if it wasn't text, it still can't inject because there's an idea of strings by default are treated as unsafe. So in order to actually have them be able to have like a JavaScript injection type thing, we would have to add some extra code to make it actually output HTML. I hope that addresses your concern, but you got to trust me that it's not, you can't just, the question is like, okay, I know that there's JavaScript. So if I did /sayhello, and then I wrote some in here, I did like, hey, say hello script.lo, and I wrote some JavaScript in here that this would execute. That's not how it works. So it's not going to do that. Okay, Felipe, I'm not going to answer that question, but if you ask it again at the end, I will be happy to talk about it. Anonymous attendee says params.inspect doesn't show the hash, but everything else works. Params.inspect won't, but you have to put params.inspect or else nothing's going to output. I don't get what you just did, like with the hello person name. Yeah, so programs don't really do very much if you can't get data into them and get data out of them. So we've written some pretty boring programs for our web server so far because we've only been getting data out, meaning like we wrote something that said, okay, the time is now the current time, or okay, you know, that we've essentially provided a path for information out of our application. This is our first time putting data into the application. And the way that we do that in this case is we are making a special route that uses this special syntax with a colon at the beginning to essentially say, okay, you can go to /sayhello/ anything you want. And that provides a path for us to capture the anything you want part via this params hash that we get inside of the controller. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, please ask again or in a different way, and I'll try to explain it a different way too. Rajesh has noticed that the output of the parameters down here, that the key is a string, but that the way that we're actually accessing it is via a symbol. Either one work. They work the same. You can use either one you want. So to go over the routes.rb line again, it's a get, which is the URL that the user is getting. And then it is to this path. So the first part is just /sayhello. So that matches up to what we're seeing here, /sayhello. And then it's a slash, and then a special piece here that does colon and then a name. And what that means is I'll allow anything after sayhello, and I want to be able to capture that first name part in the controller. And then I specify the controller name is home and the action name is sayhello. So when I defined a sayhello action on home controller, now I'm able to grab the first name, whatever it was, from the URL and get it. In this case, I put it into a name variable, and then I use that inside the output. So now I've completed the full loop of what we need to write cool programs, which is we can take something in and we can put something out. Next question is, what is the inspect line doing? The inspect line is just to demonstrate that the params hash contains this value, right? So this is the line that it's actually outputting. It's kind of interspersed here in the logs. So we can see down here in the logs that the params hash does indeed contain a value where the key is first name and the value is the thing that was passed in to the URL. So if I change this to sayhello/Abby, you're going to see now the params hash down here has changed for the next route, or sorry, the next request to have the first name Abby. Anonymous attendee says, what does puts params inspect do? I hope I just explained that. Manan says, do we have to write it before the root route? No, you don't. Julie J says, so if there's nothing after /sayhello, it will error, which means you need to get a new get for /sayhello if you want that route to work, right? That is correct. So the route is defining sayhello/something. It is not defining what happens when you do sayhello/nothing. So if we did that in the browser, we went to just sayhello by itself, then you're going to get an error. And this error is kind of hard to see, but no route matches sayhello. So that's a pretty descriptive error. It's basically telling you that there is no route that matches just sayhello by itself. The next question is, how did you get the output in the terminal? To get the output in the terminal, I added a line to the controller that did puts params.inspect. Erica asks, how do you input multiple params? We'll talk about that later. I don't want to confuse things now. Rajesh says, so get has no relation to routes from the main base URL. Is that right? That's correct. They're totally separate. Okay. I see some questions in the chat, which I'll try to answer, but if you can put them in the Q&A so that it's easier for me to know what I've done or not done. Alacon says, So you have to use params, or is that just a variable name? No, you have to use params. So this name params is fixed. Params is essentially a something that is defined inside of this application controller. So you get it by being a subclass of application controller. Params is just a method that returns a hash, and that hash contains all of the things that you need that are custom, including, in this case, our first name. ND says, it's a little black box magical that we have access to params in home controller. I don't think it is actually. I get what you're saying, but the thing that's important to note is that params is a method. Again, params is a method defined on the superclass. It's a private method defined on the superclass. So I don't think it would actually make more sense to have at params. They both make the same amount of sense, because remember, you can call a private method of the superclass from inside of a subclass. That's all we're doing. We are a subclass called home controller, calling a private method params, which we've inherited because we are a subclass of application controller. Also, anyone that like started this course and maybe didn't know a ton about programming, or is just trying to get started here, think about the fact that like 5 days ago, you didn't know what classes were, or potentially even what strings were. And now we're having a conversation about like calling a private method of the parent class, and like we're talking about it in a way that's hopefully making sense to people. So good job. Richard Solomon says the naming convention of the controller home control. I covered this a little bit yesterday, but just to really briefly go over it, when we talk about home controller here, what Rails does internally is it says, okay, I'm going to take the controller name that you gave me, and then I'm going to capitalize it, and I'm going to put controller afterward. So when you see home written in lowercase, just know that Rails is doing this transformation that essentially turns it into home controller with capital H and capital C. So yes, it is confusing that you're specifying it with the lowercase name. That's just how it works. Unfortunately, there's no way. That's just how it works. So yeah, I agree. It is confusing. Rubina, have a good rest of your day. Yeah, Sarah, we really have come so far. I mean, this is just like, it's amazing. You all are amazing. So Rajesh says param is a private method defined in app controller. I have observed we can't inherit private methods from the superclass into the base class. That's not true. You can. So you can, I guess I could show you very quickly how that would work if people are interested in that. So imagine we had a class. It's called class animal, and it has a private method, and that private method is called woo, and all woo does is it puts woo, and then I do class cat, and I give cat a public method that says meow, and all that meow does is called woo. Then I can do cat.new.meow, and if I save this and run it, sorry, cat has to inherit from animal. So if I save this and run it, you're going to see that it works. So you do actually inherit the private methods. So what you said is just, it's not right. And that's maybe part of the confusion. But params, I promise you, comes from application controller. It actually comes from the parent of application controller, but that same difference. Okay, so Karthi KWD says, why are we using params square brace of name instead of params? So the question is, we're doing this. Why are we not doing this? So remember, params is a method, except it's not a method that takes an argument. it is a method that returns, the idea of params is that params returns a hash. Okay, so params does not take any arguments. You cannot pass an argument to params. So if anything, to prove to you it's a method, I actually write it like this, right? I want to call the params method, and then the value that comes back is a hash. And then I want to, because it's just the hash, I want to access the key name. I want to get the value back for the key name. So that's the actual way you should read this, not like this. So I hope that clears it up, but I promise you, params is just the method. Cool. Rajesh says, we can't call cat.woo directly then. No, you can't. You can't call cat.woo directly because woo is a private method. You can't call a private method from outside the class. Ulija says, would it be possible to cover nested routes? We're going to do it in the future, but not now. Injury says, when you put Peter, John in the URL, will it be one string or two? It's going to be one, and we can do that. So the fact that these both came up together mean that it's going to be one. But I think you've zoomed in on maybe an important point here, which is that there are certain things that you just can't put in a URL, like, for example, a slash. That's not going to work, because if I put a slash there, then Rails is going to think that I'm trying to do a different thing. So if I ran this right now, it's going to error, because there is no route that matches Sayhello/Abby/John. So because of that, this is not always the way that we're going to get data into our controllers. So I'm not going to go further on that now, but yes, one string. You'll never get an array in. That's not how URLs work. So you'll get just one string. Manan, if you watch the recording, I covered that a couple of minutes ago, injection attacks. The code that we have here is not vulnerable to any injection attack. So. Okay. Cool. Any more questions about this? Is this making sense to people? How, I guess like the key thing you need to understand here, and you're going to need it for the homework today, is how the information for first name got from this route into the, from the URL to the route and into this controller. And if you understand that flow, then you understand it. And we're going to keep moving. Cool. I take your silence as I keep going. So what we're going to get into now is we're going to get into models. And remember, models are the thing in our app that get information and interact with the database. Anonymous attendee, where is params getting first name from? So it's getting it, if you watch the recording, hopefully I've made it clear by now, but it's coming from the URL here. And then because this is a special type of URL that has a colon inside of it, that will take the piece from the URL, in this case, Abby, and it will place it into that params, which is just a hash, or a method that returns a hash, like we've talked about. Okay, so the models are the piece of our application that interact with the database. We're going to cover now creating a model, and then we're going to go through some like how to use a basic model. So this is just another completely new topic. You're probably used to learning about new topics by now. But in order to make an application that interacts with the database, you'll need to create a model. And this is a good point to kind of I have in my notes here to reaffirm why we are doing what we're doing. So you're going to have a lot of boot camps in the world and a lot of classes in the world that are going to try to teach you JavaScript by itself. The problem is that JavaScript by itself, you can't do anything with JavaScript by itself. So you could write maybe a server application, maybe with JavaScript. But the point is that any developer developing real software in modern times, even if they're working primarily in one of these technologies, has to know that all of them exist and how they interact with each other. So it might turn out that you get a job in programming and then you choose one of the things that I'm talking about to go focus on. Maybe you're really interested in the CSS part, or maybe you're really interested in the database part, or you like algorithms or something. You can go do that, but you cannot escape the fact that your education in programming will only make sense if you know how all the systems work together. So that's what we're doing here. We're giving a bird's eye view of everything so you can see how it works together, with the hope that you can find what you like and then go find a job doing that thing. So if you feel like we're learning a lot, it's partially because we are learning a lot, but it's also, I guess, more importantly, that you have to learn a lot in order to do anything. So I covered that like a lot in the first lecture. There are a lot of pieces in modern application development, web application development, et cetera, that you need to make anything. So don't get discouraged that we're learning a lot of things. You don't need to dig deep on all of them. You have to instead focus on getting all of the pieces so that you can make something. Anonymous attendee has a question about routing. I'm going to save that just because I don't want to go back right now. But if you look up the Rails routing documentation, just search Rails routing, you'll find the answer to that question. Okay, so let's create a model. So I'm going to exit my, I'm going to go over my terminal, and I'm going to use Control-C to exit my Rails server. So now I'm back at this this directory, and I'm able to put commands in again. And remember, when we created our controller, we did Rails generate controller home controller, right? And what we're going to do instead today is we're going to use a different Rails generate. We're going to use Rails generate model. And because we love to talk about people here, we're just going to make a people model. So let's do it. Hit enter. And we're going to see that a couple files got created. So first file I want to talk about is app models person. So I'm going to open it up so we can look at it. This is the person model. So this probably seems pretty familiar to the controller that we generated earlier. The person model, or what we'll talk about as the person model, is again just another class, just a class in Ruby, except this time instead of inheriting from application controller, it inherits from application record. Okay, so application record is the main thing that your models will inherit from. So just instead of application controller, application record. And the other file that got created for us, oh, thank you, code spaces. The other file that got created for us is this file. And this is what is called a migration. So if you remember yesterday, when we were playing with SQLite, just to show you again, kind of what that looked like, we were playing with SQLite, and at some point at the beginning of it, I ran this statement in SQLite. It says create table people, name varchar, age varchar. Okay. Does anyone remember what this statement did? It's probably pretty self-explanatory from the beginning of this. It created a table called people. Remember, that is the red box here is the table. And it gave it some columns. In this case, it gave it a name column and an age column. So you can see name and age. Okay. Now, because I promised you that in Rails that we will not be writing SQL, what Rails gives us is it gives us a way to tell it what SQL to write without actually writing SQL. So the way that it does that is it's pre-filled kind of all the information we need. This is the name of the table. And we're going to go in here and we're going to say it takes a string, t.string, name, and t.string age. Okay, so if I'm going to take this t.timestamps part away. So this is the equivalent of the thing we wrote yesterday. We're creating a table called people, where each row in the table people has the columns name, which is a string, and age, which is also a string. Zaya says t.table or t dot for table. Yes. And remember, this is just a block. Hopefully this looks familiar. It's just more Ruby code. So we're calling a method called create table. We're passing it the name of the table, and then it takes a block. So it gets out this thing, which is they called T, but we can just as easily call whatever we want. So this is a way to define the table in Ruby instead of defining the table using SQL. Because again, we really, really don't want to write SQL. Mixolydia, I hope I'm saying that right, says we don't have to state the number of characters. And that's right. If you don't state the number of characters, by default, it's going to do exactly what we did yesterday, which is it's going to create a column that can hold a maximum 255 letters. Anonymous attendee says, what does the table.string line do? Yeah, so what it does is it says we want to create a column on people called name, which is a string. That's what the line does. And then obviously the next line does the same thing, except the name is age. And we can actually do, it might be interesting. We'll change that. Okay. So what this says is that we want name to be a string, and we want age to be an integer. An integer is just, again, a whole number, like the ones that we've seen a bunch of other times. Okay, so this is the name of just the thing that we have to call these methods on. This is the type of the column, and this is the name of the column. In this case, it's name, or I'll call it first name, so we don't confuse people. We have first name, and we have age. And yes, it's just an, Andre says, it's just an empty table without any values. Yep, all we are doing here is we're creating the structure. We're creating the red box, and we're creating these two columns here. So no rows, nothing inside of it. Okay, I promise you all a break every day that I normally don't give. I'm gonna not teach anything new until 6:05. So I'll stay here and answer questions about what we've seen so far, but we're not going to do anything new. I just want to give people a chance to kind of collect themselves, let it all sink in, but I'll be here to answer questions in the meantime. This would also be good if people want to ask questions here that are maybe like slightly off topic. I mean, I don't mind. I'll do my best, but I can't go deep on any topics. So if you want to talk about something off topic, just keep it short. Okay, Arveso says, can you explain : migration? Yep. So we haven't seen it, but we talked about, I think briefly on a previous lesson, that classes can technically live inside of other classes. So when you have classes, let's say you have a class called the active record, And then inside of it, you have a class called migration. You imagine these are inside of Rails somewhere. They're inside of the library of Rails. So if you need to be able to refer to the inner class, the colon is what you'll end up putting between them in order to refer to this inner class. So you're saying, I want the migration class, which lives inside of the active record class. Again, the reason I don't teach things like that is because you're not likely to need to know them, meaning the migration file is generated for you. So you never have to touch that line, but that is what it means. Karthi KWD says in table.string, is string a class or a method? String is a method. So string is just a method that happens to have a name that is string. So it actually, you could write it like this if you wanted to, because they're just methods. Anonymous attendee, how do we create the table for the function we just made? I'm going to show that after the break. That's what we're going to do. We're going to create the table, and then we're going to put some stuff in it, and we're going to see what it is like to query that table and work with the table, things like that. Manon says, so it basically inherits from migration. That's correct. Migrations are just classes, like pretty much all the other things that we've seen in Rails so far. A migration is a class that just happens to inherit from a base class called active record migration. Justin says, how did you get the Db Migrate create people file? That I got by running Rails generate model people. So remember, Rails generate is like a handy way to create a new model or to create a new controller, or we'll see later that it can do a bunch of other things too. Piara says, can I perform arithmetic operations in def change? Sure, you can do anything you want. It's just a Ruby method. So you can write any code you want inside of def change. I don't know why you would, but you can do whatever you want. So just to be really clear, the database migrations are built to describe the shape of the tables. So we're basically describing this. And then what Rails does is it takes the things you write here and it turns them into a SQL line, create table, people, first name, varchar 250. Like it creates this SQL so that it can run it. And Rails does that all for you. Richard Selman has pointed out a fun thing, which is that, of course, Rails has somehow figured out how to map the name person, which is the name of your model, to the plural name people. So normally it's pretty easy because you can just put an S on things, but Rails has somehow figured out that person, the plural of person is people. And that's right. The reason for that is that database tables are typically named in the plural, but our models are not. They're named in the singular. So Rails is smart enough when you generate a model to know that the model name should be singular and that the table name should be plural. Akil says, can we store private information like passwords and usernames in a table? You can do that, but you should not do that. So you can store usernames, that's totally fine. But storing passwords is a little bit trickier. We can probably cover that toward the end of the course. But if you're interested in reading up on it in the meantime, the answer is that you essentially need to not store the password in clear text. You don't want to store the password as just a string, because if you do store the password as a string and your website were to get hacked or something, then someone is going to have all those passwords. And just so many people in the world tend to use the same password for all of the sites that they use, that if you stored the passwords as clear text, that you would end up leaking their password that would be used for other sites. So the way that you actually store passwords on the internet is you have the password the person put in. You have the password that someone put in, which you can imagine over here. And then you imagine like a grinder, right? And that grinder is a one-directional grinder. So think of like a meat grinder. And so the password goes in and we put it into the grinder, and the grinder turns it into some other thing. So imagine like you have the password, you put it in the grinder, and then some other thing comes out. And the key part, just like a meat grinder, is that you can't ever put something backwards through this process. You can't ever take the decrypted version and turn it backwards through the grinder to get the original password back. So this is how you store passwords. And then you're probably wondering like, oh, if I store passwords in this like weird ground up version that can't ever go back, how do I know if the user types in the right password? Well, what you do is when they go to log in the next time, you take their password again, you run it through the grinder, and you compare the ground copy to the ground copy that you've stored. So every time they type in their passwords, you run it through this one-way process and compare it with the stored copy that you've already run through the one-way process. So this is a way to store whether or not they're typing in the right password without actually storing the password. And this is called password hashing. That's what we call this. I can actually demonstrate it. So if you look down here, and I type in MD5 John, sorry, echo, let's install MD5. I think I should be able to do this. Maybe not. MD5 sum. Okay, so let's say I put John in. I can do this as many times as I want. And then this random series of characters is going to come out. This random series of characters represents the string John. So if I put something else in like Kate, it's going to get a different series of characters. That's how the grinder works. So if I go back and I do John again, you see it's the same thing it was before. So that's at a high level how you store passwords. Jessica says, could you explain again, why do we need symbols for people, first name and age? You don't. They can be strings. It's okay. The reason is that typically strings are only used when you're dealing with some kind of like a, either you're outputting something or you're dealing with some kind of input. So for example, we'll refer to the key first name as a symbol, but the actual value, Abby, will come into our application as a string. And that is to say that when I do params of first name, that is returning a string, which in this case is Abby. So I know it's kind of a funny line, but the answer is that for the most part, you can use them. You can use either of them in Rails. You can use them whenever you want. You just can't, you can't use them interchangeably, meaning like if you create a hash and it is keyed with strings, then you cannot access that hash with symbols. Rails is in a lot of ways built to be kind of foolproof. So Rails pretty much everywhere lets you use either. You don't have to use symbols or strings. You can just use either. They've built all of Rails to be able to work with either one. Rajesh says, if string and integer aren't the data types, what are they? Oh, they are the data types. Yeah, so different databases have different names for these data types. So for example, string in most databases is called varchar, but some database might come in the future that it's not called varchar. Integer is not always called integer. Sometimes it's called small int. Sometimes it's called unsigned small int. And the reason that we call string an integer is because Rails is not making any assumptions about what the underlying database is. So you use these nice names, and then Rails handles all of like the nitty details of like, how do I convert the thing that I know the person wants, the developer wants, to the actual SQL that I'll have to run to make that real. Okay, 607, let's get back into it. Okay, so the next thing we have to do is we have to run our migration. To run our migration, we will use Rails Db Migrate. Okay, so that's Rails space DB :migrate. This is just the command that you're going to have to know. That's how you run migrations. Another way that you could run migrations is if you refresh the page, sometimes a button will come up that'll let you run the migrations, but for the most part, this is how you do it. Rails Db Migrate. And you'll see what it's done. It says, oh, I create people. Let's create table people. Okay. So it's created my table. This is what it looks like when it succeeds. It says, oh, I created a table called people. Okay. And now what I will do is I will show you how we actually interact with it. So we can do another thing called Rails console. You'll run Rails Db Migrate every time that you make a modification, every time that you create a new migration. Okay, so you can think of this is the actual migration file. Rails Db Migrate is the thing that says, oh, okay, actually go run that migration file. Actually go do that thing. So we created the file that says what you have to do, and then Rails Db Migrate says, now go do it. Yes, you have to run Rails Db Migrate if you add or change columns. The application will still work, but until you run Rails Db Migrate, you won't have access to the new columns because the Rails Db Migrate, again, is the thing that actually reaches out to your database and runs those migrations. Okay, so I'm going to type Rails console, then I hit enter. And here's what happens. I get dropped into a terminal where it's asking me for input. It's very similar to this terminal I had before, except this one is actually me now inside of Rails. So I can do things in here that I could normally do for Ruby. And I can do something like puts hello. Oh, it didn't output it, which is funny, but let's do something. Let's type person. Oh, my output's not working. That's not great. Okay, we're gonna need to figure out how the output, how to get the output to work. So let me just give me 1 second here. Puts hello did work for someone else. I'm pretty surprised that it wouldn't work. So let's kill the terminal instance. Let's try. Oh, it did work. It only worked when I switched to a different tab. Anyway. Seems like a bug. I will report this bug. In the meantime, I'm not super sure what to do about that. But in the meantime, what we'll do is we'll switch back and forth, which is going to be kind of annoying, but it should be okay. So if I call person, you're going to see this thing. It says person. It says call person.connection to establish a connection. So it tells us what to do. Let's do person.connection. Yeah, CodeSpaces is a beta. That's correct. So it's not surprising that there's a bug here. That was one of the pieces of feedback that I got when I asked to use it, was just know that there are potentially going to be issues. Okay, person.connection, it outputs a bunch of stuff. Don't worry about that. And we'll just type person again. And you'll see when I type person this time, what it does is it shows me the person class. So this is, remember, person is the name of the class. Can I split window? Okay, that seems to help. I appreciate that. Thank you. So person is the name of the class, and you can see here that person has an ID. It has a first name, and it has an age. Okay, so this is our person class. This is the name. This is basically what we've described here. We've described first name and age. And the ID is, and when you put something into a table in a database system, normally there needs to be an ID for each of the rows. So the ID is the ID of each of the rows. And we can talk more about that. And yes, to the person asking, that is a primary ID. So ID is the primary ID, which is created for you. Okay, so how do we create a person? In Rails, what we do is we use a method called create. And to create, we have to pass all of the things that you need to create a person. So we do first name, and we do age, and then we hit enter and see what happens here. It says, okay, I called person.create. And then Rails was like, okay, you want to call the create method. I'm going to turn that into SQL. And it created this SQL. It says insert into people, first name, age, these certain values. It even automatically used prepared statements for people that know what those are. And then it committed the transaction, and then it returns you the person that it created. Okay, so person.create has put data into our database. So we can even do something now like person.count, and you'll receive 1. And you'll see that the way that person.count is working is that actually what it's doing is it's executing select count from people. If you're getting bash person command not found, you're not inside of a Rails console. You have to type Rails console, and then your stuff should work after that. Okay, so what is happening here is that Rails, when you execute each of these calls, yes, is translating the call to SQL. So there are a bunch of methods that are defined on the application record base class that we are now getting because we have inherited from application record. We get access to all of those methods. So one method we get is the create method. And another method we get is the count method. And you can see, so in this output here, we can see when it does equals greater than, and it shows something like that, that's the return value of the previous line. So when we ran person.create, the thing that we got back was just an instance of the person object. Sorry, the person class. And it's an instance that has the data that we put in. When we did person.count, the thing we got back was an integer, which represents the total number of people in the database. Okay. And then if you do person.create, we can create another person. Kate, age 34. Okay, so same thing. We did insert into people, adds the first name, adds the age, and then returns the person it created. Okay, so what's person.count now? 2. So hopefully if you're thinking about a spreadsheet in your head this whole time as being in the model for what a database is, this is making a lot of sense, because when we call person.create, all we're saying is, I want to insert a new row where the values are John and 34. So I've done that twice. And then when I say person.count, it's basically saying I want to count all the rows. Since we've put 2 rows in, the count is 2. If you're stuck at Rails console, I mean, that's the point where you'd start using things like person.create. So we can keep putting people in here. I'm actually going to put a person in here named Julian. Julian is 32. So now person.create is 3. So Andre asks, how does it know that count means count star and not something else? The reason is because imagine, okay, you're the person class and you're inheriting from application record. Application record on it has a method like this called count. And what it does is I want you to execute select count star. And this is roughly what happens. There's actually a lot more happening inside of Rails, as you'd imagine, but this is roughly what goes on. It's going to say select count star from table name. And in table name would be another method that in this case would return people. So the reason that it is knowing that it's count star is just that's how the count method is implemented. That's just how it works. And we can actually look that up too. So we can say count active record base for else. If we look that up, we will see dot, 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 dot. So this is just like the Ruby documentation, but this documentation is for Rails instead. So if it ever loads, basically if it ever loads, you'll see that the documentation for count says that what it does is to a count star on the underlying table. So that's how it works. Andrew says, how does it know? Oh, okay, I just did that. Julie J says, do you ever use or write SQL? Hopefully not. I mean, the active record layer inside of Rails, what we call the ORM, which stands for Object Relational Mapper, is super robust. So for the most part, you will not be writing SQL at all. And then Arreso says, can we display all of the entries in the database at once? Yeah, that's exactly what we're going to do in a second. Okay, so the question is, what else can we do with the database? If we do person.all, you're going to see what gets returned here is an active record relation object. But at the front of the active record relation object, you're going to see this little square brace. And you're going to see that the things inside of it are the actual records. And you can see all of our records here. There's the John record, the Kate record, and the Julian record. Now that square brace is hopefully ringing some bells for people, which is a square brace normally means that the thing that we're talking about is an array. The active record relation is an object that behaves just like array behaves. So if we do person.all.first, it'll give us the first person. If we do person.all.last, the last person. Person.all.sample, it'll give us just a random person. So it is an object that behaves like an array. It's not an array, but it behaves just like an array. An array of objects. We can even, if we want, we can call 2A on it. And what that means is to array. So you say, I want to get all of the people, and what that will return is an active record relation. Calling 2A says, okay, just put those into an array for me. But for the most part, you will not need that because the active record relation method works just like an array. So all is how you get all of the things out of the database. So another thing you might want to do pretty often is you might want to do a where query. So I have to show you how the where query works. So if I do where age is 34 dot count. Okay, so this is pretty crazy. I've done person dot where age 34 dot count. And what that does is it makes Rails go execute a query that says, I want to select a count of all the people that have the age 34. And the answer is 2. So by chaining together multiple calls, Rails has given us a way to use just regular Ruby to build any query that we want. So person.whereage34.count gives us 2. And you can imagine if we wanted to get the records, we can do .all, and we will get just those records. So now we're selecting all of the rows and returning the actual records. We actually can even take the all off of here and it works the same way. So person.whereage34. Now, there's going to be a lot of records coming back. But like I said, these are just, they act like arrays. So if I do person.where.each, I can go into a block where I have a person inside, and I can do puts p.name, sorry, p.first name. And you'll see my output is the first names of the 2 people who have the age 34. Now, if you've ever written SQL or worked with the database before, you got to admit this is pretty cool. It's really cool. And if you haven't worked with the database before, then please drop any questions you have so that we can talk about them and get it to be clear for you. Manon says, what is the 2A part? Yeah, so like I was saying, when you call something like person.whereage34, it returns an active record relation object. It's an object of the class, an instance of the class active record relation. That object behaves like an array, but it is not actually an array. So 2A basically turns that object into a real normal array. Notice that if I chain things together, okay, so if I do person.whereage is 34, that's going to execute a query. But if I chain something on the end, it's going to execute a different query. And the reason that we don't want to use 2A all the time is because the keeping it an active record relation makes it so that we can continue to chain things on, and not until we actually use the value does it actually go query the database. So we can continue to chain things. Jody says, what is limit 1? So what is limit 1 is, limit 11. So limit 11 here, I'm not going to go into it now, but the idea is that because it knows that what it's trying to output is for just outputting in this terminal, the Rails is actually choosing to put a limit on the query so that when you execute something that potentially could return millions and millions of rows, it stops you from doing that by saying limit 11. Andrew asks, why is there a double colon between active record relation? I covered this a little bit before, but if you have a class that's nested in a class, the colon is just how you get to the inner class. So again, you'll never have to know that. All you'll have to know is that when you're talking about active record relation, it has the 2 colons in it. It's just part of the name, essentially. So someone asked, can you do SQL where first name like %A? You should look it up. You can do it for sure. It's a like query. You can do it in Rails. Adnan says, can you show us how to change terminal to say 1 Ruby bash? It's only saying that because I split the terminal in half using this little split button here. So it's saying that the left one is Ruby and the right one is bash. Yeah, so the place to find docs about this, and this is, by the way, is that count method that I was talking about, returns the number of records that meet the conditions, but by default conditions is empty. So the place to find it is somewhere like this. If you look at this, you'll see all of the different methods you can call on the classes. And then there's also documentation like this that you can find for where to call on the instances. There's also a Rails guide. I would say search something like Rails guide active record. These guides are very nice. They provide a lot of detail about what you can do with these objects and things like that. Johnny, it's only limit 11 when you're in the console. It won't be limit 11 anywhere else. It's just to protect you from potentially pulling back too much data and overwhelming your console session. Adnan, we can try to figure it out after the class. Andrew says, if you exit the Ruby shell, will your records be saved? Okay, let's try. So I'm going to Control D to get out of the Ruby shell. I'm going to use Rails C to go back in, and I'll do person.count, and you'll see that they're still there. So yeah, our database is persisted now. Now remember, our database that we're using is the SQLite database. So actually, in SQLite, the database is just stored inside of a file. And we can see that file right here on the left-hand side. So db development.sqlite, that file is actually where the data is stored. And you see that it's gray here. And that's because it is not going to be committed to your repository, because you wouldn't want your database to be committed to your repository. So it's automatically excluded from being committed. Yeah, if you're having any trouble and it just says bash, then, or you're doing something like person.something, and it's saying no command found, then you are not inside the Rails console. You have to type Rails console to get inside. Okay, let me keep going. When we talk about operations on a database, we typically talk about 4 letters. They are C, R, U, and D. So that means CRUD when all put together. And what it stands for is it stands for create, read, update, and delete. Okay, these are the 4 operations that you can do on a database. When you think about our analogy to a spreadsheet, it's like create is I want to be able to put things into the spreadsheet. Read is I want to be able to read things out of the spreadsheet, either as a whole or be able to pick different sections of them or individually. Update is I want to be able to take a piece of information and I want to change it. So that's like editing a row in a spreadsheet. And then D is delete. So that's I want to take a row in the spreadsheet and I want to get rid of it. So we need to learn how to do all of those operations in our database. So we've done create. We create via person.create. We've done read, which we do via person.all. And there are many other ways to do that. Person.where is another way to read. Person.count is kind of a form of reading. And so now we have to learn update and delete. So in order to update, first we have to be able to get a handle on an object. The easiest way to get a handle on an object here is just use person.first. So look, we did person.first, and Rails was smart enough to say, okay, I want to select star from people. I want to order by ID ascending, meaning I want to order by the order they were put into the database. And then I only want to take one of them. Just so cool. And if I look at the person object that I've got, this is what it looks like. So the person object has an ID, which is 1, the first name we put in, and the age. And I can actually update it by calling a method called update. So update takes in the same type of arguments that create took in, and I can use them here. So if I want to change the first name to John, all capitals, I hit enter, and you'll see what happens here. The database says a call to update people, set first name equal to John, where ID is 1. So this is how I do an update in Rails. I can update the data in any table. And now to prove to you that's updated, I'll do person.all. And we can actually see that now John has a capital JOHN. I can even do, if I want, person.all.each person puts person.firstname John with a capital J, OHN. So we're going to learn it in the future, but there's also other things that you get when you use update like that. You can add validations and all kinds of amazing things that we're gonna cover today and tomorrow. Okay, so now we've got create, we've got read, and we've got update, and now we need delete. So the way that we delete is we do, say we have the person object again, we can do person.destroy. So when you call destroy on an active record object, it will execute a delete call in the database, which will remove the record. So now if I do person.count, it's only 2. If I do person.all, there is no more John. So we've done the whole thing. We've done create, read, update, and delete. CRUD. There's a lot of nuance to all of those. There's more of it, but this is the things you need to do it. Okay, we got a sad face. Someone doesn't like CRUD. That's funny. Okay, so someone asks, if you insert a new record now, will it be 1? The answer is no, because, and that's not because of Rails, that's because of the way the database works. The numbers are meant to never be used again. So if you take something that's 1 and you delete it, and then you create a new object, that's going to have the ID 4. Manon says, what's the difference between Control-C, Control-D, Control-Z? Yeah, Control-C and Control-D are very similar, meaning they exit the program that you're currently in. Although Control-C will not always work. So I would say, like, if you're trying to Control-C something to interrupt it and it's not working, Control-D is kind of the next place you should head. I'm not going to talk about the differences too much, but and then Control-Z is something entirely different. Control-Z takes the program you're running and sends it to the background. If you don't know what Control-Z is, then you probably shouldn't use it for now. But that's what it's for. Richard says, does this only affect the first record, or is it the first call which defines which record is affected? Yeah, so when I did here, I did, remember the way that I got a person object is I called person.first. So now when I call things on person is now the first person in the database, which is the Kate object, because I've deleted the old first thing. And when I do person.firstname, or I do person.age, everything that I talk about when I talk about lowercase person here is talking about the instance person. So when I do person.destroy, it will destroy only that one person. Rajesh, there are ways, but I'm not going to be covering them. Look into transactions if you're interested in ways to roll back potential changes that you might not want. Arvreso asks, if you destroyed someone accidentally, can you undo it? The answer is pretty much no. So once you've committed a change, the change is permanent. Manon says, can you allocate a person by index? I'm guessing what they're asking is, can you get a person by index? And the way you can do that is you can do person.find. Find is another active record method that takes a number. That number is the ID, and it will give you the person that is that ID. The way that it does it is it does a select where people.id equals the ID you passed. So you could probably also guess if you pass an ID that doesn't exist, you're gonna get an error back. It's not gonna work because it doesn't mean anything to get something that doesn't exist. So it's an error. Okay. Let us keep going. Now, because can you pass multiple where or conditional where? Yep, you can. So if you do something like person where name is Kate, sorry, first name is Kate, dot where age age is 45, then it's going to return empty. So you're combining multiple wheres. When you do multiple wheres like that, they're anded together. They all have to be true. And we'll cover in future lessons how to do ors, but you don't need those right now. Since John, great question, Julie. So since John was saved in a variable called person, can you still access the person after they've been destroyed? The answer is yes. So if I have person, which in this case is Kate, and I destroy it, I still have the object person. I still have it sitting in a variable. But if I do say person.destroyed, I think, you'll see that it returns true. So Rails knows that the record has been deleted, but because it's in a variable, you have the handle to it until you let go of it. So I hope that answers your question. You still technically have access to the person object, despite the fact that it was destroyed. Okay, now we're going to go a little deeper, which is that, like I've been saying, the person class is just another class, just like all the other classes. So because it's just the normal class, you'll notice that we have certain methods on person. So if I do person.firstName, it returns the value of the first name. And there's no reason that I can't go up here and just define my own other methods. So I can say something like, maybe something like name and age. And it could return a string that says something like first name is age years old. Now, I've made that change. In order to see it in the console, I need to use a thing called reload. That's only when you're working in the console. If you're doing work in the actual, like the web server is running, you don't have to do this. But if you're in the console and you don't want to have to exit and come back in, you just have to call it reload. It'll reload, and then I can actually take a person. So I'll say, in this case, I'll say person equals person.first again. Person now holds Julian, who is 32. And I can call person.firstName like I could before, but I can also call person.name and age. So we're actually able to put instance methods on the actual classes that represent the models. Johnny, if you just call person.connection, should fix that. So we're actually able to put our own methods on the models because they're just classes. And when we use something like first name here, what that's actually doing under the hood might seem like magic, but it's not. What it's actually doing is it's calling a private method called first name, sorry, a public method in this case, called first name that is defined for us inside of the parent. So it's defined for us automatically in this case. So this is like kind of true. It's defined for us automatically. So you imagine like, notice down here, I was doing person.firstName. That's showing you that the first name method exists. And now I've added another method that just happens to call the methods that already existed, were defined by Rails. So I can even do like, I think I can do this, public methods. So that's a list of all of the methods that exist on this object. And I can say, does that include first name? And the answer is true. So there's a method on the person object called first name. And there's also now a method called name and age. Is this making sense? Is this making sense how this all comes together? So just like when we were working in controllers, remember we were working controllers and I created a private method and then I used it from inside of this method because it's just a regular class. Same thing here. These are just regular classes. So you can define public methods on them. You can define private methods on them. You can do anything you want in here. You can even, if you want, you can override first name so that no one can actually access the first name. So if I did something like this, and I reload, and then I did person equals person dot first, and I did person dot first name, now it'll be nil because I've essentially replaced the implementation that was given to us for first name, which would normally just return the value of the first name. I've replaced it with something that just returns nil, because remember, implicit return here would return nil. Okay. So just to say that classes that represent models are just classes. If you're getting an error undefined method, it really could be a lot of different things. Make sure that you're referencing these names correctly. They need to match the names of the fields that you had. Anonymous attendee says, I'm getting an error of name change due to record being destroyed. If you post it in the chat after, we'll try to help you out. In general, if you try to do like an update on a destroyed record, that it doesn't really make much sense. So that maybe is what you're running into. Okay, the last thing I need to teach you in order to do today's exercise is, I believe I need to give you the knowledge of how to tie the model layer and the controller layer together. Because remember, in the model view controller architecture, these three layers have to work together. There's a view layer, model layer, controller layer. If they are separate and they don't talk to each other, then we're not really building a web application. So they need to all know about each other and talk to each other. But remember, it's just Ruby. So let's give it a shot. Remember, we have this base route. I'm going to go back to the base route. And currently our base route is set up to, I believe, output a random friend. Okay, so let's wait for it to load. Oh, great. It's not working because my Rails server is not started. So I will start that server up. And we will click open in browser. And now you're seeing here, okay, my friend is named Julian. So let's change that so that instead of choose a friend method picking from this random list of people, it picks from the database instead. Okay. We already did this actually. So person.all.sample. So that's going to be a random person object. And then remember, we don't want to return a person object from this method. We want to return their name. Person.firstname. Because of implicit return, this is going to be returned. So now if we go back here and we refresh, we're going to see that the answer is always Julian. The reason it's always Julian is because we only have one entry in our database. I can use this little split that we have here. I'm going to open up a console over here. And I'll do person.create, name, Greg, age, I don't know, 2. Sorry, first name. First name, Greg, age, Greg says 29. Okay, so we've seen an insert here. And if I go back here and I refresh it a few times, we're going to see that we get a difference between Julian and Greg. So now our web page is calling the database and then rendering that information to the user. So we've like kind of completed a full loop here. We're putting data into a database and we're reading it out. So hopefully if you're the type that likes things like building blocks, you're kind of getting that what we've been doing this entire time is kind of building more and more blocks. And we're getting to the point where now we can take data from a database and we can take input from a user and we can put stuff into a web page. Now, if we can make the web page look nice, we're kind of really close to being able to make a meaningful application. So, okay, my name is Julian, right here. We can even do something like this. Imagine if Sayhello, imagine if when you called Sayhello with a first name, we wrote something into the database. I don't know, I feel like we have all the pieces to do that, right? So person.create, the first name will be the name that got passed in. And the age, we don't know what the age is, so we'll just put 0 for now. Okay, so when I write this line, all of a sudden we've modified our Sayhello endpoint so that when you go to it, now if you go to Sayhello with a certain name, that name will go into the database. And then because the index route is returning a random thing from the database, the two will connect to each other. So let's try it out. Let's go to Sayhello/Lil. Hello, Lil. And let's go to Sayhello/Johnny. And then let's go back to our root URL. Look at that, Johnny, Lil. We have one route that's writing something into the database. We have one route that's taking something out of the database. We learned all of that just now, the whole thing. We didn't write any SQL at all. It is so cool. It's just so cool. Currently, this method, by the way, returns a string. It would be just as easy if you wanted to, let's say, choose a friend, returned a person instead. So now this returns a person object instead of a string, right? So now choose a friend, I can actually go up here and I can say choose a friend dot maybe name and age. Okay, and then if I refresh, okay, my friend is named Julian, is 32 years old. Greg is 29 years old. So we're using our custom method that we put on the model because we have a handle on the person object inside of the controller. Super powerful, super cool. Okay, I'm gonna answer some questions, then I'm gonna go over the homework. Did create work in the second terminal? Yes, it did. It didn't work the first time, and it says, see, it says unknown attribute name for person. The reason it didn't work the first time is because my model person does not have a name attribute. It has a first name attribute. So it's just a typo on my side. Adnan says, that's what I was missing, Rails C, problem solved. Good to hear it. Thank you for updating us. I'm glad that you got it figured out. Isaiah says, if you delete your own first name method, will it revert back to the default first name one? It will after you do reload. And actually, that's the good thing to show right now is that, let's say I make a modification. You're probably noticing this while I'm doing it. I save. I didn't have to reload my server at all. These things just update automatically. The server automatically picks up your changes. So you don't have to do any kind of reload anything while you're developing. It just automatically is there. Manon says, how do you take multiple inputs from params? I'm not going to go too deep into it now, but if you construct a URL that has multiple colon pieces inside of it, you can take multiple inputs. We're also going to talk about other ways to do that in future classes, because we're going to have to do entire forms that can take in pieces of information. Rajesh says, why is there a bang in create? That is just habit on my side. There's actually two methods. There's one called create and there's one called create bang. The difference is that the create method will return false if it is not able to create the thing for any reason, and create bang will raise an error. So it's a matter of habit. I use the create bang one instead. All the way in where it says where to choose friend come from. I made choose a friend. It's a private method on the controller. I did that as part of going over the exercise at the beginning of the class. Anonymous attendee said, how do we go from the person to person variable in the terminal? Will that be in the recording? Yeah, that will be in the recording. And the way that we did it is person with a capital P dot first. That's how we got out. That's how we got a handle on one of the person objects. And then there's a question asking if I can show my routes.rb file, which of course I am happy to do. This is how it works. Oop. Cool. Okay, let's go over the homework. And I want to talk a little bit briefly before I go over the homework. I'm going to talk about what we're going to cover tomorrow. So we're going to cover tomorrow is we're going to have multiple models that are working together. And we're also going to cover how to validate data in your models. That's probably as far as we'll get tomorrow. So we'll do multiple models and how they can interact with each other, and we'll do validations. So that's going to give us the ability to do a bunch of other interesting things. For example, if you had a, when you're on a website and maybe you're in a conversation, the conversation has multiple comments inside of it, we're going to be able to build those relationships. So we need to be able to make it so that you can have one thing that actually has a relationship to other things. Karthi KWD says, can we get access to your repo later in GitHub? I actually don't. I think I can figure out that for future classes, but right now I don't have anything really pushed to my repository. But yeah, I don't see the harm. I could definitely take this repository, I could push it, and then I could just give you all access to it. If that's helpful for other people, I'll do that. And then every week it'll change though. So it won't be like a long-term thing that you'll have access to. Felipe says, is there already some machines translation software which translates from, let's say, Ruby code to natural language? Not that I know of, but it's pretty close. It's pretty close already, you know. I'll make a note to push my repo. And when you see it, it'll show up in your list as CJON test, because that's the name of my repository. Okay, the homework. This is what we're going to do. You are going to create a new model to store information about cars that is going to include their make and their model. So those are both strings. There's a make and a model for cars. You're going to open a Rails console, and you're going to manually create a few cars, and then you're going to update your controller to show a list of your cars. Now, in order to do that, you're going to need access to a new method on array. That method is called join. I will briefly show you how join works, just because I know it could be confusing. So the way that join works is, imagine you had a string hello, a string goodbye, and those were in an array. The way that join works is you do array.join, something like that, and you puts it. Then what you'll get is hello, comma, goodbye. So it takes all of the things in the array and it joins them with whatever string you place inside of the first parameter to join. In exercise 2, which is definitely more difficult, I want you to take in the make as a param in the controller that you made for displaying the cars. And when that param is present, when the make param is present, I want you to only return cars that match the make that was passed in. Okay. So there will be essentially an endpoint in your app, something like /cars, /cars will return all cars. And then when you do /cars /Mitsubishi, that is going to return only Mitsubishi cars. Yep, this exercise is going to be tough. I think that all of the concepts that you need to do this thing, I've definitely presented in this class. They're in this lecture right now. But I gotta be honest, it's not easy. So have fun. I mean, if it was easy, then you're not going to learn anything. The idea here is to stretch your boundaries a little bit. So if you don't get it by tomorrow, don't be too hard on yourself. I mean, don't spend 20 hours trying to do it, but do put in some effort. Give it your best shot and see what you can do. So the way you create a new model is you do Rails G model and then the name of the model. Someone asked to see, Oloason says, I want to see the person model, which again, I'm happy to show the person model. So the person model is, pretty empty. It's a custom method that we defined, which in your homework, you're not going to have to do that, I don't think. So your car model is basically just going to be an empty class. So it's a car class that inherits from application record. To close the Ruby console, you should be able to do Control D. So if you're here, Control D. Control C will not do anything because you're in an interactive terminal. So Control D is how you get out. You can also type exit. So just if you're in one, you type exit, then you'll be out. Cool. Any other questions? We did so much. This is a lot. Yeah, there's a lot to know. I mean, you could spend weeks going into all the details of the parts that that you're not going to have to know. So what we're doing instead is we're focusing on the parts that you need to actually build something. I'll definitely talk about my 3-car garage. About my dream 3-car garage. What would be my ideal set of 3 cars? Julie, I appreciate it. And I appreciate you being up for it. I know it's a lot. I know it's daunting. So keep it up. You're doing a great job. And another thing is lean on each other where you can. I'll be in the chat whenever I can, but I know that there have been some study groups forming. I love that. I think there might be one in 15 minutes. I might be completely making that up, but the study group is a good 30 minutes. Okay, the study group is a good way to dig a little bit deeper into the concepts and help each other where you can. So I really appreciate all of your time and ambition, and yeah, the recording on this one's going to be pretty helpful because there is a lot here. Cool. I will see you all tomorrow. Oh wait, I have a couple questions. I'll answer the questions. Okay, the question is, how do we open the terminal again? You open the terminal with Rails console and hit enter. So if you're over here, you type Rails console. If you want to do it the pro way, you just type Rails C, which stands for Rails console. Rajesh says, I have a doubt. Why are you using the colon in table string name? You don't have to. You can use a string instead. You can use either one. The reason I'm using the colon is because it is a symbol, and that is typically what you do when you're referring to something that can't change, when you're referring to a fixed thing. Ernest asked how many of us showed up today. I think the peak that I wrote down was 95. So kind of, following the normal trend that kind of we're expecting to have here. Although I will say, I think part of what's going on here is that some people aren't just able to make all the classes. If you look at the YouTube views over time, they've stayed pretty steady. We have about, I think, 240 or 250 views on each of the videos. So there might be people out there that are just not able to make the sessions. So if you're one of those people, keep it up. We'd love to have you here if you can make it in. Okay, no more questions. I will see you all next time. Yeah, the sessions are great because you can ask questions and I'll try to answer them the best I can. Manon, I'm going to talk about cars. Don't worry. I love cars. All right. See y'all soon.